some sort of board, government entity in Oregon that regulates the functions of public educational institutions. And they issued a ruling that it was a violation of state procurement laws to have for a university to have a licensing contract with a brand that required the brand to do something not directly related to the performance of the contract, the provision of the product at the agreed price and delivery time. In other words, that imposing labor standards on these licensing agreements violated procurement policies designed to preclude nepotism and so forth. And so Oregon withdrew not just from the Worker Rights Consortium, but also from the Fair Labor Association. And to my knowledge, it is not a member of, participant in any organization doing code of conduct work. And they did ultimately get their grant. And we used to joke about this because I think the fee that Oregon was supposed to pay to us, they were actually paid, which is 1% of the licensing revenues, was $3,000 or $4,000. But the joke, of course, was that their fee was $30 million. $3,000 because, but they did ultimately get their grant. And I should say, the relationship between the WRC and Nike is very, very different now. Nike does not encourage universities to leave our organization. We managed to work together in various cases. None of us agree, of course, on the issues, but that's what happened.
If I could just take one moment to pull back for a second. I was supposed to do a few remarks on the two days. I would love to do that just to be able to focus a couple of points that I thought were interesting. Both
I do appreciate you dignifying my comments by referring to them as a paper.
Oh, well. Which means that I didn't take a look at it beforehand, so these are all the one of the things that I think is highlighted in both of these conversations is just the huge information problems that exist, and that I think were beginning to be highlighted last night as well in terms of proliferation of brand names. So that the question ultimately for a lot of folks is going to be, how do I know what a label means and what does anything signify in any particular process? And so there's overlapping kinds of standards that we get between Whole Foods and fair trade and the proliferation of Walmart standards. It makes it very difficult for consumers to know these kinds of things. When we couple that with the issues that are starting to be raised here about monitoring and agency problems, so the question of who is actually doing the monitoring, when we look at those kinds of situations, it becomes very similar to the problems that we've had with financial accounting agencies that have been hired by corporations to look at the books, and then you find out that the corporation, that the accounting agencies that have been hired, although they have a part of the responsibility to be fair and objective, that they have a fine relationship with their people who hire them, so they'd like to be rehired as well. So you have the temptations that exist around those issues as well. I think one of the things that you've been highlighting here, and I find the fact that both of you, I think, talked about this both, but you talked about it somewhat in different ways, is this issue of price. And I think one of the things that we're seeing in your discussion about side selling is that there's this fascinating relationship that exists not just between the buyer country and the selling country, but it is between the less developed countries competing for business from a brand name agency. So if you have countries in which there is a wage of, say, 20 cents an hour, and another country in which the wage is 40 cents an hour, ultimately those groups are going to be pitted against one another for competition. And it's that competition that is particularly intense, which reminds us of the old sweatshop conditions that have existed everywhere we look. So that the question is, how do we actually deal with a floor across the bottom, and does that floor then eliminate some of the people who have already higher wages from competition, or does that provide a premium for the people at the bottom of the wage ladder to be able to make the improvements in conditions that Scott's talking about? But it does get passed on to the worker that we have these other kinds of conditions of people coming in and saying, well, I'm going to be a middleman in this particular process and offer you a slightly better wage. And then we have this question about whether or not the standards are going to be observed altogether. So we have a regulatory regime problem, which is very significant, very complex, and requires a lot of thought about how one is going to put that together. So I think all these papers begin to, all these thoughts begin to talk about the complexity of the problem here in terms of how do you actually maintain a price premium when there are different standards in different less developed countries and workers competing against one another for those kinds of positions. So I think those are the things that particularly stand out in my mind about these talks, and the ways in which that people are beginning to think about it strikes me as very creative and very important, but it still seems to me that we have some issues yet to go. So with that, Richard.
Yeah, I think the price thing is critical. Maybe that makes accountants feel good. Price stuff. Could you give some estimates for both of you, because of the costs on both sides? If I put in standards in my factory that the WRC would consider good, how much extra is it going to cost me? Is this 10 cents on the $1.22 T-shirt? Is it 50 cents? And the same thing is for the coffee. If these are very expensive, then you've got a problem. If they're modestly expensive, then you've got a good gun. Your work will work really well. So
well, at the factory level, there are some exceptions, but at the factory level for most apparel products, the factory's labor costs represent between 6 and 10% of production costs. So the big question is whether you're talking about living wage, which is, if you're not talking about living wage, then it's much, then the increase in cost at the retail level is negligible.
6% of the total price. It's not
Of the factory's production cost. So the factory, 6 to 10% of the factory's cost. Between 6 and 10.
Closer to 50% of factories.
No. It's very low. And it's one of the ironies of the whole debate.
6% of the retail price. 6% of the retail price.
It's 6 to 10%, between 6 and 10% of the factory's production cost. So, but we promote living wage, so let's take that. And the rule of thumb we have is that the living wage in most of the countries we're talking about is roughly 3 times the prevailing apparel wage. So let's say it's 8%. Labor cost is 8%. So you're talking about 16% more, plus a percent or two to address the other labor issues. So let's say you're talking generously about a 15 to 20% increase in production costs. Now that's not accounting for efficiency gains, which are going to be significant, because one of the big obstacles to higher levels of efficiency in apparel production is the massive turnover, which is a direct, almost exclusive result of the very low wages and poor conditions of work. So you're going to get some feedback on that, and I think it's significant. I don't think that you can ignore that. But let's call it 16% for sake of argument. Now, the product, of course, is marked up very substantially between the factory door and the retail shelf. Generally speaking, the rule of thumb is there's 100% markup between the factory and the wholesale price that's charged, and then another 100% markup by the retailer. So the T-shirt that's sold for $5 by the factory is sold for $20 by the retailer. So a big question in terms of price impact is the increase in cost resulting from the higher labor standard, is there a markup on that, or is that simply added on non-geometrically up the supply chain? If there isn't a markup on the price premium necessary to achieve the labor standards, then at each level where there's a 100% markup, the percentage increase is half. So instead of being a 16% increase, 8% wholesale, 4% retail. So what's 4% on a $50 sweatshirt? $2. If there is an attempt to mark up on that, then obviously the increase is higher. Even so, it's not astronomical. It's very unlikely to be more than 20% under any circumstance. And if what retailers and brands constantly say about the tremendous price competition that exists at the retail level and the unwillingness of consumers to tolerate price increases, we presume that they will limit the degree to which there's a markup on the price premium, simply because some retailer or brand will see an opportunity in not marking up on the premium and therefore being able to lower their price, and others will follow suit. So our expectation is that we're talking about price increases that generally speaking will be less than 6%, but they might be 10, they might be 10%, they might be 15%.
And then the label or the statement they would make would be something like this. Here's the $50 sweatshirt. And of this $50, $2 is going directly to raise the wages of the workers in the country. That's what you're paying. And that would be sort of vouched for by some organization or by the company, and in fact, that would occur, because you wouldn't want to have that statement be lying about it and be caught, that'd be terrible. So